And I grew up observing all those obligations of Islam. I remember by the time I was an adolescent, I had already started fasting, frequently praying during those months, celebrating all the holy days. So it was a pretty staunch Muslim upbringing in my life. By the time I was 10 years old, or even before that, I had already learned to read Quran. My view of Allah, standing before Allah in my prayers, was that Allah was at a distance, and there was certain prayers that I had to do at certain times a day, and they were at a certain specified times, and if I missed those specified times, I could not go back to that, because that was the requirement of Allah. It was the perception in those days in my mind was that what I did was right, and what I thought was right would please Allah, and if Allah was pleased, then there was paradise for me, and if Allah was not pleased, then I would not be a candidate for a paradise. So that was my perception in those days, and it was a general perception, I believe, from my family, background also at that point. So I grew up with that kind of a background of that belief. I kind of was fading away from the regular practice of Islam until I met my wife. She was a Catholic, and it really didn't matter to us. The religion was not an issue between us. But what began to happen was that after we had children, I began to see her more as a Christian than what I knew when I first met her. And that influence of Christianity, her faith, began to spill over into my children's lives. And I began to see her exerting some influence, or even just my children seeing her faith in their mother. And that kind of roused up the Islam in me again, and I became more of a furious Muslim than I was ever in my life before. And in the process of that, I began to convert my entire family to Islam. I wanted my wife to become a Muslim, I wanted my children to become a Muslim, and I began to teach Arabic to my children. I began to teach them Quran, because I was always under that pressure put on myself that my children must call themselves Muslim. And my children, having a curious mind of children, they began to ask me questions about Quran, and they began to ask me questions about Islam. And I began to realize for the first time in my life that although I knew how to read Quran and I knew fluently to read Arabic, etc., I didn't understand what it said. My answer was kind of vague, or I would become even more stubborn and just would have them believe without any question. I had a dream. I am standing in a church, and it is a Russian church, and inside the church were the Cossacks or the Tsars. They were dressed with woolen hats, etc., heavy woolen coats, and they were breaking down the altar. And I was standing there, and I was watching them breaking down the altar. And one of them broke the altar and handed it to me, and I was holding it on my shoulder with the cross resting on my shoulder. And all of a sudden I felt a tap on my head, and I didn't seem to pay any attention to that. And then suddenly I felt another tap on my head, and as I turned around, I looked back and I saw the symbolic image of Jesus looking at me, smiling and becoming alive. And the dream ended with vivid colors. And I woke up the next morning, and there was a remarkable change in myself. And the first significant change that occurred was that I stopped all the Islamic teaching to my children and the oppression to my wife. And I remember that day vividly, that I felt as if I was walking on the air. And I began to occasionally get attracted to the Christian faith, wondering what this is all about. And I began to see Christianity in my wife, and I began to see what really a Christian is, because my wife became a very strong Christian through her own crisis in her life, and I began to really see what a real Christian, true Christian is. And that kind of drew me and attracted me to know more about it. I started talking to one of the pastors of the church that my wife used to go to, And that pastor was very kind, and he showed a lot of love and received me without putting any kind of pressure on me about any kind of faith, and just showed me a lot of love of that what God is all about. And I began to kind of see God in him, that this is truly a relationship that he is manifesting in my life. So that was another phase in my life where I began to be exposed to the Christians. I began to be exposed to the Christian life. But still, I thought I could call myself Muslim and at the same time lead this kind of a life and be a Christian at the time without calling myself a Christian. I was listening to sermons and I was attracted to the Christian message, and one of the sermons that I listened to was a sermon on the resurrection. And that sermon had a profound impact on me. It just satisfied all my intellectual curiosity about resurrection, because resurrection in Islam is denied, that it never happened. So when I listened to the sermon, the question that came to my mind after listening to the sermon was, what is going to happen to me after I die?